So inside Photo RAW, you start inside of the Browse module. So inside of the Browse module, this is where you're going to find your photos. And you can also organize inside of the Browse module by rating and culling. Well, inside the Browse module, let's just start with this left side over here. And we're going to start with this Browse tab right here. So inside of our Browse tab, don't worry about this area right here with catalog folders. The more you start using the program, you'll definitely get into catalog folders, but for just now, let's worry about this area right below that, and that's our local drives. We have our local drives right here, and this is going to house anything that's mounted or stored on our computer. So if you have an SD card, an external hard drive, or your actual computer's hard drive, that's where you can view these areas on this folder. Right in this area here, if you plug in an SD card, you can instantly see that SD card and you can immediately start browsing through those photos. You actually don't have to import anything into Photo RAW to start using the program. Of course, you can import, so if you do want to import, and that's your prerogative, which a lot of photographers really like to import their photos. So if you want to import your photos, head up to your top bar here, go into File, and then you can just click Import. And so now we have our import dialog. We can choose a source. So we can go and choose an SD card or an external hard drive or whatever folder we want to import from. And it will import in there, and we can choose all of these different modifications for importing. But if you don't want to import and you simply just want to browse through your photos, this is a really good place to start. Below our local drives, we have our cloud storage. And cloud storage is an awesome way to keep track of your photos so you have access to them across all of your devices. And one of my favorites is my Dropbox. So connecting a Dropbox or a Google One account or a Google Drive account is really easy within Photo RAW. Just click on this and it will navigate to you how to find the Dropbox folder, and you can easily install it to use it with Photo RAW. So now that we know where to find our photos within these local hard drives, let's go ahead and browse through these different photos to show you how easy it is to find your images. So inside of my local drives here, I think the majority of my photos are kept just on an external hard drive. And I usually keep them on this DK My Passport. And I actually just bought this hard drive about a month ago, so there's not too many files on it. So we'll just go into this hard drive right here. So let's say I've inserted this hard drive into my computer. I can just click on it, and these are all of the different photo folders on that hard drive. Well, in this middle area of Photo RAW, this is where you're going to view the photos and all of the different folders. So if I want to make these thumbnails bigger, oops, let me pull this over here. So if I want to make these thumbnails bigger, an easy way to do that is just to go down right in this area here, and I can modify the thumbnail size with this slider right here to either make them smaller or bigger, depending on however I want to look at them. So if I want to go into a folder, there's two different ways I can do that. So I can actually just click on the folder preview, and it will take me into that other folder. Or I can go into my local drive section here, and I can just use these arrows, and I can navigate to that folder manually. But once we go into a folder here, you can see that we have all of those different photos that live within that folder. And you can look at these photos just by double clicking on them. And now we have our detail view for that image. And there's a few different ways that we can actually view the photos or our library of photos inside Photo RAW. So this first view is our detail view mode. You can also access that by hitting E on your keyboard. Well, we were just in our grid view mode. So if we want to go back to grid view mode, where we have a row of different thumbnails, we can just hit G on our keyboard. So G has taken us back into our grid view, where we have all of these different thumbnails inside of our folder. But if we want to go back into detail, we can just hit E on our keyboard. And another fast way to look through your photos is to pull up your Filmstrip view mode, which you can access by hitting F on your keyboard. So now I have all of these different photos that I can browse through on the bottom of my photo, while it's pulling up a thumbnail preview of the actual photo up top. I'm just going to go back into detail view mode. And then I'll hit G, and I'll actually go back into grid view mode. And so inside of Browse, like I was saying earlier, it's kind of the place you want to find your images. Well, it's also an area that you can organize as well. So if I want to organize inside of Browse, I can do a few different things to do that. One of the things that I can do is I can create subfolders within folders really easily. So if I want to create a subfolder, I can just select a group of photos. Oops, I should probably hold down Shift. And once I have that group of photos selected, I can just right click and I can add a subfolder. So I can just type in beach scene, and if I click add, it will move all of those photos into a different subfolder. So if I have a subfolder, like I do in here, an easy way to organize folders or photos is just to drag and drop. So if I wanted to drag this subfolder into a different area on my hard drive, I could just click on that and I could drag it into a different area on my local drives or my cloud storage. Also in Browse, one thing that I really like to do is I like to create albums. And creating albums just allows you to access photos quickly whenever you reopen the program. So for webinars, every time I have a new webinar, I go in here and in my albums pane, I use this plus button and I click on it. I create an album and I always create a new album for my webinar. So next week's I think is creative editing with filters. So now when I prepare for this webinar, I can go in, and if I go into a subfolder here, let's say I want to add a few of these photos. I can just click on these shots, I can drag them over to my creative editing with filters album. It's dropped them in there. So now if I close the program or I leave into a different module and I go back into Browse, I can always go back into this album, and if I click on it, there's those photos that I have stored on the album. Well, one album I made was this guided tour. So I have an album made with a few different images that I want to show you how to edit. So when we're inside of Browse and we've found a photo, let's take a look at this photo for example. Let's say we're looking at this photo inside of Browse, inside our detail view mode. Well, let's say we want to go in and actually edit this shot. A quick way to transfer between modules is to use your keyboard shortcuts. So to transfer between my Browse module into my Edit module, I usually hit the D key on my keyboard. So if I hit D on my keyboard, by hitting D on my keyboard, that's going to tell Photo RAW to take me into my Develop tab inside of my Edit module. So now I'm inside of my Edit module, and this is where we're going to actually modify our image. This is where we're going to apply different adjustments, creative filters, and local adjustments. So for those of you who are just starting out with Photo RAW, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the Edit module here. So in the Edit module, to the left over here is going to house your tools. So all of these different tools are what you can use to modify your image. Now, if you're not sure what that tool does, just simply hover over it. It will give you a little animation of what that tool does. And you can also click on this Learn How button, and it will send you to a video that will explain how to use that tool. So just hover over the tool, and it will give you a nice description of what that tool does. To the right of that, we have our presets. Now this is just going to house all of the different presets inside Photo RAW. It comes with a bunch of different presets that are already loaded into the program, but you can also add in custom ones or import ones that you've downloaded from ON1 or Gurus or whoever it may be. So this is our preset pane here, and if you're not really interested in presets or you just want to hide this to have a bigger view of your photo, go down here into the left corner right here. You can click this button and it will hide that preset pane. So now I have a larger view of this image, and it makes it easier to edit. So obviously in the middle of the frame we have our photograph, so this is going to show our picture. And then to the right over here we have our top pane, which is going to give us our navigation. So if we want to zoom in, we can click on these four icons here, either 100, 50, 25. And then we have levels, which is going to show us our histogram. We then have info, which is going to give us our camera info and our metadata. And then we have history. So this history pane is going to show us all of the edit history and adjustments we've made to this image. So I'm actually going to leave this history pane open while we edit this image so you guys can see all of the different adjustments that we make to it. And once we've made any adjustments, if we go back into our info pane here, this settings applied area, if we click on it, we should have some different settings applied and some different highlighted areas in the settings applied section. So we'll go back into this history pane over here to leave this open. Well, below our history pane, we have our layers here. So this is going to house all of the different layers that are on this canvas. So we only have one here because we've only opened up one photo, but we can use these different buttons down here to add and modify different layers. Because this is a beginning webinar, we're probably not going to get too deep into layers, if at all, but just to know that it's right there, this is your layers pane. Below that, we have the different tabs inside of our edit module, and this is probably where you're going to be spending the majority of your time, are in these 4 tabs here. So this first tab here is our develop tab, and the develop tab is great for modifying the raw data in your image, or if it's a JPEG, just the data in your photo. You're going to be adjusting the exposure, the contrast, sort of setting your foundational look for the image. And inside this tone and color pane, we also have our color. So we can modify the color to correct for color cast and remove too much saturation. Below that, we have details. So we can actually use this to modify the different sharpening and noise reduction. And then we have lens correction, which is automatically going to detect a lens for you. So let's actually start out with this tone and color pane. And the first thing we're going to do this photo is we're going to crop it real quick. So as I go into the edit module, one thing I like to do when I first start out is I crop my shot. And then I go into tone and color. So let's start out with those 2 areas first, and then we'll move on to our effects and our local adjustments tab. So I've just gone into the edit module by transferring from browse, and I'm like, what should I do first? Well, I really like to crop first. So for this particular photo, because I do have a horizon line here, it'd be great to see if it was level, and I'd also like to remove this kind of blurry head from the bottom of my frame. So to grab your crop tool, and if you're not familiar with the keyboard shortcuts in Photo RAW, all you have to do is hover over one of the tools, and it'll show the name of the tool here, right here, and then in parentheses, it will give you the keyboard shortcut to grab that particular tool. So for crop, it looks like it's a C. So I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard, and now I have my crop tool. So for this particular shot, I think we just need to check the leveling and then pull up on it to remove this little head here. So to make sure it's level, I go up to my leveling tool right here, and I can click on it. And if you click down, you can drag on a horizon line and it will straighten your photo, or not straighten, it will level your photo automatically for you. And now I can just pull up on it a little bit. Oops. There we go. And I've removed that head sitting there from the bottom of my frame. So that's the crop. And so now that we've cropped the photo, we can head into our develop tab, and now we can start actually making different adjustments using our tone and color. And if we go up to our history pane here, you'll notice that it says crop. So it's actually recording that we've made that adjustment, and it's showing us that we've cropped our photo. If we go into our info pane here, we go to settings applied, we have crop and level is highlighted, telling us that we've modified our crop. Okay, so inside of the develop tab, with our tone and color, one thing that I really like to do, and I'm sure if you've watched webinars in the past, you've seen me doing this, but I typically shoot RAW, and it's not a big deal if you don't shoot RAW. You know, a lot of people shoot with compressed files, and that's completely fine. But one thing that I like to shoot in RAW for is the ability to change my camera profile. And this area, this camera profile section, can apply a lot of style and detail with just one click. So one area I like to check out before I modify any of this area inside of my tone is I go into my camera profile, and I usually put it on ON1 landscape just to see what it does to my shot. And I can see that it's brightening it up a little bit too much, so I'm actually just going to leave my camera profile the standard. But just keep in mind that you do have all of these different camera profiles that you can access within this tone and color pane. And so inside our tone, we have the kind of normal sliders for adjusting a photo. We have our exposure, our contrast, our highlights, our midtones. Well, one thing that you can use to really help out when you're modifying the exposure is to hold down your J key. And a lot of people don't really know this, but if you hold down your J key, it will show you your true white and your true black in your photo. So if I hold down my J key here, there's nothing being shown on my shot because there isn't any true white or true black. But as I start to pull up on the exposure here, oops, maybe a little too much. As I start to pull up on the exposure here, you can see that there's true white coming into my frame. Well, this is a good way to show that you're overexposing your image. So whenever you're modifying this exposure slider, it's always a good idea to hold down your J key. And then if you're removing exposure, or let's say we have our exposure set and we add in contrast, if we add in too much contrast, it'll show us our true black without any detail in blue. So these are just a few different ways that you can show yourself either A, I'm overexposing this image, or B, I'm adding in too much black. So we'll just set the tone here, and I'm actually just going to pull back on the exposure a little bit, just to bring a little bit more detail into these clouds. And by pulling back on the exposure, I'm obviously removing brightness from the image. Well, the cool thing about Photo RAW here is we have this midtone slider, which really helps pull out areas on a subject. And so your midtones are probably your grayish tones in your photo. So there's a lot of gray tones sort of in this rock here. So if I pull up on my midtones, it's just bringing in a little bit more of that midtone boost to the rock so that I can see some more of that detail. And now let's go down, and I'm probably just going to pull back on my black slider to add in some contrast. And whenever I'm pulling back on my black slider, I typically hold down on my J key because watch as I pull back on my blacks. Well, maybe not, but if it were an image that had a lot more contrast, you could see the contrast right away. But this image is pretty flat, so we can pull back on the blacks quite a bit. Perfect. And you can see up here in my history pane that this is recording all of the different adjustments for this photo. So let's say I wanted to go back from that black point and my midtones. So let's say I just wanted to go back to when I modified my exposure. Well, I could go up to this history pane here, and I could just click on exposure, and now it's taking me back to where I have no midtones or blacks modified. And so you'll see up here in my history pane here that these two areas are unhighlighted. Well, watch as I go down and make another adjustment. I'll just pull up on the shadows this time. You'll see that after I pulled up on the shadow tones, it removed those top two and put in that other history element. Well, that's because it removed those two adjustments that I made when I clicked below back to the exposure. So now I'll just add in a little bit more true black like we did earlier, and then I'll warm up the photo a little bit by going into my color pane here. And if you're shooting in RAW and you're going into modify your color and it's showing up as 0 and not as a Kelvin, you can click on this K and then it will show up in Kelvin. So now I can pull up on my temperature slider to warm up the photo a little bit. Perfect. So when you go into the edit module, those are probably the first two things that I like to do, is crop and then set the basic tonality for the photo. So after I've set the foundational look for my image, I typically like to go into effects, and this is where I start adding different creative styles to the image. So let's go into effects here. And in our effects tab, this is where we're going to add in different filters to our image. And ON1 Photo RAW has a ton of different filters already preloaded into it. So if I select add filter, I can see I have all of these different filters that I can apply to the image. And if I'm confused on what a filter does, or I need a better understanding of what that looks like on my shot, you can just hover over any of these filters. It will give you an explanation of what that filter does, and it will also show you a before and after with that filter being applied to a photo. Another cool thing is you can actually search for filters with keywords. So let's say I'm in filters and I want to apply a filter that adds detail. I can just type in detail, and now I have all of these different filters that will allow me to apply detail to my photo. Well, let's actually add this dynamic contrast filter here. So now we've added that dynamic contrast filter to our image. So if I turn this filter off and on, you can see it's applying a nice bit of detail to our photo. Well, inside all of these different filters, every single one of these filters in here, there's a bunch of different options that you can use to modify each of those filters. So inside this dynamic contrast filter, and probably 90% of the filters, it's going to be the filter name, opacity, so you can change the opacity of that filter. There's going to be a row of preset styles and then a more menu that you can choose from. And then you're going to have different adjustments and modifiers that you can use to either crank up the contrast or remove it from your photo. So inside dynamic contrast, you can see we have these 3 different main sliders that we can use. So we have small detail, medium detail, and then we have large. Well, watch as I pull up on the small detail. You'll see it's applying detail to the small contrasted areas on this photo. So that's an easy way just to go in and modify your filter. And remember, each of these filters is going to have different adjustments that you can use to modify it. Well, let's say I've gone in and I've modified a filter. So we'll pull up on the small a little bit. Maybe I'll pull up on the shadows, add some black, some white, and then we'll add in some color with some vibrance. Boom. Well, let's say I really like that filter and I want to add that style in so that I can apply it later whenever I apply this filter to other photos. So if you have a style in one of these filters that you like, you can actually save it as a preset. So I can go into this more area right here. And if I click more, I can go down to save new style. And I'll just save this as fav DC for favorite dynamic contrast. So if I hit enter now, I can go into that more and I can click on that fav DC style and it will apply that preset style to my images. So inside of effects, that's how you add in a filter and you adjust the different styles within that filter. Well, another area that you're probably most likely going to be modifying photos in is this local adjustment tab here. So inside of our local adjustment tab, this is where we're going to use different local adjustments to modify our image. And local adjustments work a little bit differently than effects, whereas local adjustments aren't applied to your photo automatically. So you'll remember that when I added that filter inside of effects and I turned it off and on, it was applying detail to the entire image. Well, you'll see here, if I turn this adjustment off and on, nothing is happening. Well, that's because we have to selectively apply local adjustments to our photo using different masks. So with a local adjustment, if we go into our local adjustment masking options here, we can see that our mask view is completely black. That's because it's that's because it's concealing the entire local adjustment from the photo. So white reveals and black conceals. So if we want to apply this adjustment to our photo, we're going to have to do it using either an adjustment brush or a local adjustment gradient. Well, for the purpose of this webinar, we're just going to start out with the adjustment brush. So whenever I add in a local adjustment layer, it's giving me my local adjustment brush already. You can see I have my local adjustment brush with this circle and then the plus sign within it. Well, over here, you can see that that local adjustment brush is selected because it's in blue. Well, any of these tools over here are going to have a top tool modifier bar section. So when I select a tool from this area, I'm going to have different modifiers that I can use to adjust the power and the impact of that tool on my photo. Well, for this particular tool right here, I have my adjustment brush selected. And if I hover over it, it's telling me that I can also grab my adjustment brush by hitting K on my keyboard. So K will take you to your adjustment brush. And I also have my mode right here, which is telling me it's set to paint in. And there's 2 modes, paint in and paint out. Well, paint in is going to paint in an adjustment or a filter, whereas paint out is going to remove an adjustment or a filter. And then if you're familiar with brushes, we kind of just have, basic digital brushing options. We have our size, our feathering for the hardness of the edge, and then our opacity for, how little or how much of that adjustment we paint on. So for this particular photo here, I'm actually going to raise my brush size with the bracket keys on my keyboard. So I'm just hitting the right brackets on my keyboard, and I'm just going to brush this adjustment on the bottom area of my photo here. Boom. So I brushed that adjustment on the bottom area of my photo. So now if I go over to my local adjustment tab here, I can see that in this mask view, there's a little bit of white on the bottom. So if I view this mask, I can see that this white area on this mask view is representing where I've brushed that adjustment on. So if I go back and view this photo, and I turn this off and on, you can see that adjustment is strictly being brushed onto the bottom part of this image. Well, in this adjustment, I can always go over and I'll just actually lower the opacity so that's not so strong on my photo. But there we go. I think it does a good job of just kind of toning down the look on the water a little bit. So now if we go back into effects here, and we go into our dynamic contrast filter, we can access the masking options for that dynamic contrast filter by clicking on this masking icon here. So before, when we added that filter and we turned it off and on, it was applied to the entire photo already. Well, that's because this mask view, if I view this mask, it's entirely white, because white reveals and black conceals. So because this mask view is white, it's revealing this entire dynamic contrast filter onto our photo. Well, inside the masking options here, one basic thing that will really save you a lot of time when masking is just to hit this invert button if you want to brush it on selectively. So if you want to do like we did with the local adjustment layer and just brush it onto an area that we want, we'll just click invert here. And so now the mask view is completely black. And whenever we're modifying masking options in a filter, we're going to be using our masking brush. Now, over on this left side, you'll see that we have our masking tools selected, whereas before we had our local tools selected. Well, our masking brush and our adjustment brush are the exact same thing. They do the same thing. They can be modified the same ways. The only difference between the adjustment brush and the masking brush is that the adjustment brush is strictly for local adjustment layers, whereas the masking brush works on effects and layers. So because we're working inside of the effects tab and we're working with filters, we're going to be using our masking brush. You can also grab your masking brush by hitting B on your keyboard. So with our masking brush selected right here, we now know that if we want to paint in an adjustment or a filter, we have to change our mode to paint in. I can also change the size of my brush by using the bracket keys on my keyboard. So I'm just going to lower my brush size with the left bracket key, and my feathering and my opacity is at 100. Now I'm just going to brush this dynamic contrast strictly onto my rock. Sweet. So now if we go over to that dynamic contrast filter and we view our mask, you can see where we brushed it onto, and that white is representing where that filter is being applied to on our image. So now if I view that photo again and I turn this dynamic contrast filter off and on, you'll see it's strictly being applied to the rock area and it's not being applied anywhere else on this image. And so if we go up under our history tab, you can see that it has all of those different adjustments that we've applied to our photo. And then if we go into our info pane, inside of our settings applied, we have a few different areas where we have a bunch of settings applied to this image. So let's move on to another photo, and we'll move on to a more advanced editing technique, and we'll use different gradients. So let's go back into Browse here. And one thing I can do to transfer between the modules and go back into Browse is just to hit G on my keyboard. So if I want to go back into Browse from Edit, I can just hit G on my keyboard, and it will take me back into the Browse module. Awesome. So let's go back into that album real quick, and we'll grab another photo here. And let's actually work on this B shot. And again, so I have this photo selected. I'm in detail view mode. And I can know I'm in detail view mode because if I look down here, in this area right here, I can see that my detail view mode one is selected. Whereas this is grid, and this is Filmstrip. So detail view mode, and now if I want to go into the develop tab, I can just hit D on my keyboard. So now that we're in the develop tab here, we can go up to our history pane, and you'll see we have nothing applied to this shot yet. And in our info, all of our settings applied is set to nothing. So again, whenever I go into the edit module, the first thing I probably do is I like to crop the photo. So again, we can just hit C on our keyboard. That will grab my crop tool. And by grabbing my crop tool, I have, again, if I choose any of these tools up here, I'm going to have a top tool modifier bar. Within my crop tool modifier bar, I can choose a preset crop with this menu here. If I choose original ratio, I can actually modify the ratio customizably. And if I want to make this a vertical image, I can just go in between the width and height, and I can click it, and it will switch it to a vertical or a landscape. Just going to switch it back here, and I think a 4x5 looks pretty good. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. We'll just pull this over a little bit more. Perfect. Okay. So now let's hit enter on our keyboard. And we have a cropped photo. So now that we've cropped our photo, we can head into the develop tab here. And we can go over to our tone and color pane. And this camera profile, let's check and see what happens. Boom. I'm in a huge difference just by using a different camera profile. So if I turn this off and on, you can see that ON1 landscape profile really brings out some detail, some contrast, and pulls up some exposure from the photo. So now inside my tone and color pane, I don't really have to do too much to this image to make it pop. All I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up on the exposure a little bit. I'm going to pull back on the highlights. I'm going to boost the midtones a hair, and then I'm going to pull back on the whites a little bit. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, we have a nicely cropped photo, and we sort of set the foundational look for the shot already. So let's go into effects here, and we'll add a filter. And one of my favorite filters to add onto photos is this curves filter here. And inside the tone curve, a lot of people don't like to add the tone curve because it seems a little daunting, but the tone curve is an awesome, awesome filter that really allows you to pull out all of the tones within a photo. So inside the tone curve here, an easy way to explain it is this left area is your shadow tones or your blacks. This middle area is your midtones, and then we have our highlights. So in this area down here between our midtones and this black point is going to be shadows. So if I pull on this line right here and I pull up, it's going to reveal shadow tones. And if I pull it down, it's going to add in shadow tones to add in contrast. Well, a fun thing with the tone curve is you can actually modify this curve to pull down shadow tones and boost midtones. So if I pull this down a little bit, probably about right there to add in some shadowy contrast, well, I can go back and I can boost the midtones a little bit. And that will add in a nice bit of color to this photo. Well, one cool thing about Photo RAW is that you can access a lot of the different masking and blending options for any of these filters, local adjustments, or layers really easily. And blending modes can be really kind of daunting as well, but there's a couple that are really, really simple and anybody can use them. So we'll use one of those right now. So inside of my curves pane here, if I turn this off and on, you'll see it's brightened up the color, brought back some nice saturation in this photo, but it's added in a ton of contrast and there's a lot of black where there could be some detail. So what I want to do with this tone curve here is I strictly want to apply it just to the color so that there's no tonal contrast. So if I want to do that, I can go into my curves filter here, and if I click on this blending mode icon, now I have my blending options. Well, this is going to show me all of my blending options. So if I click on this mode here, don't pay attention to any of these just yet. I know there's a ton and they can be really confusing, but just strictly pay attention to these two here, this luminosity and color. The luminosity blending mode is strictly going to apply whatever filter or local adjustment to the luminosity or the tones in your photo. So that's basically going to apply adjustments to the brightness and the contrast and the tonalities in your image, whereas this color blending mode is strictly going to apply it to the colors in your photo. So now if I click on this color option, and if I go back to normal, see how it adds back in all of that contrast? But if I go down into color, it only applies this tone curve to the color. So that's just a quick way that you can boost up color strictly by using this gear icon here. So I really like what this color is doing to this bee here, but I feel like it's a little bit distracting in this flower area. So if we want to apply just this color tone curve to our bee, we can do it by using a masking bug. So there's masking bugs and adjustable gradients. So if I want to use a gradient to selectively apply this curves filter, I can grab my masking bug by hitting M on my keyboard. So I'm in my tone curve filter and I've hit M on my keyboard. So now if I go over to my tools over here, you can see that this mask tool section is highlighted again. But if I go up to the tool modifier bar here, this middle tool is being highlighted and not my masking brush. Well, your masking brush works like a masking brush would, and it brushes on different filters and layers. But your masking bug works by using gradients to do the same thing. So with your masking bug, you can use different shapes to modify and blend layers and filters and local adjustments. So now that I have my masking bug selected here, I can choose a different preset. And if we go into the preset menu here, and if you look at these different thumbnails, I don't know if you can see them very well, but you'll notice that on the thumbnails, there's an area that it has black and an area it has white. Well, in these thumbnails, that's showing me the area that that filter is going to be revealed and where the filter is going to be concealed. Well, because I want this filter only revealed onto the right area, the area near my bee here, I can go up to my preset menu and I can choose linear left. Because I can see that that white area is on the right side of my frame, while the black that's going to conceal all of that filter is applied to the left. So now if I drop this down here, and I turn this curves filter off and on, and it's kind of hard to see, but if you look just strictly in the bee here, and I turn this curves filter off and on, see how it boosts up the color in this region only, and it leaves this left side of the frame alone? Well, that's because I'm using a masking bug. And the cool thing about the masking bug is that you can actually modify the feathering and the rotation really easily. So inside this masking bug, if I want to move the masking bug, I can grab this big handle right here, and I can move it around. If I want to feather the masking bug, I can feather with this perforated edges right here, so I can either make it a little more feathered or a little less feathered. And by feathering, I mean the softness of the edge. So if I go into my curves filter here and I view this mask, you can see that the softness of the edge is right here. And this left side, where the black is, there's nothing being applied, and this right side where the white is where that curves filter is being applied. Another cool feature with masking and the basics of masking is just to copy and paste masks. So with this area, I can see that this curves filter is only being applied to the right side of my photo. Well, if I want to use this same sort of mask and apply settings to the same sort of area, I can actually copy that mask and apply it to different filters. So if I go in here and I copy this mask I can add a filter, and I'll just add a vignette. And if I turn on Big Softy, you can see it does an awesome job, but it kind of tones down this area to the right here, and I don't really like what that's doing around this kind of winged area. So if I go into my masking options, I can paste this mask that I just copied, and you'll see by pasting that and I view this, it's applying that filter to the right side of my frame. So if I view this photo and turn this off and on, it's strictly applying that vignette to the right side. Well, if I want that oppositely applied, I can just click invert here, and now it's applied to the left side of my frame. So now if I turn that vignette filter off and on, it does a good job of kind of toning down these highlights in this flowered area. Okay, so now we can move on here, and let's actually go into our local adjustments tab. And let's add, or in this new local adjustment layer, I'm actually going to go in here, and I'm going to go into more, and I'm going to choose Magic Eye Fixer. So with this Magic Eye Fixer, it's raising the exposure, it's adding some structure, and it's removing some haze. So that's just basically going to boost up some exposure, add in some detail. So if we want to add in a little bit more detail and sort of a exposure boost to this area on our B here, we can just use our masking brush to do so. So I'm just going to use my bracket keys on my keyboard. And now I'm just going to brush this on. And with local adjustment layers, whenever you apply a local adjustment layer and it seems too strong, what I like to do is I'll head over to my local adjustments tab here. I'll go into my opacity, and I can lower that opacity to 0. Then, if you incrementally pull it up, it can really help to save some time and also make it look a lot less crunchy and oversaturated. Sweet. So now let's go back into our Develop tab here. And let's say we've modified this photo quite a bit. So we have some different adjustments applied to this shot. Well, there's a few different ways that we can actually save these settings as a preset. So if we want to save these settings as a preset, one way we can do that is we can head up to our top bar here. We can click Settings, and then we can click Save Settings as a preset. Another way to do that excuse me, inside of each of these tabs, except for our portrait and our local tab, inside of the Develop tab here, we have this icon right here to the left. This icon is Save Preset. So if you click this icon, it's going to pull up your Save Preset dialog. And now inside this Save Preset dialog, we can use this to modify which adjustment we want to add into this preset. So we could just name this B Macro, and we could go into this menu here. We could add a new category if we'd want by clicking on this top bar here. We could add in a new category, Bs. And then in here, we can choose different adjustments to add into this preset. So if I wanted to add in that crop and level, I could do that. If I retouched, I could do that. If I added text, I can go into my Develop tab and I can modify each of these different adjustments. So if I don't want, let's say contrast, or I don't want shadows, I can turn those off to modify this preset. And if I want to add in the masks that I used, I can actually go into my local adjustments and my effects, and I can select Apply Masks. And so whenever I add in this preset to a different photo, it will automatically apply the masks as well. You can also do the same thing by going into your Effects tab here. And right here to the left, right next to our masking options for our filters, or our Effects tab as a whole, is I can actually click this Save Preset icon as well.